So we need, so thank you. So I believe that there will be a very nice session. Thank you for coming. I would like to thank you for being here. Let's start. So how should we start? So in this beautiful blue planet's human journey, which lasted over 2.5, 2.5 million years, covers a basic story, the basic worry, and the goal of the human being has not changed since the beginning. What is our basic concern? And our goal is to be able to survive. So there are three indispensable and needs that cannot be postponed. First, we have to breathe. We cannot give up that right and this need, and we cannot postpone it. What else? We have to drink water, and we have to also feed ourselves, and we need nutrition. These are the three basic needs. Food is a human right. It has to be a human right. Food is a basic survival human right. And in terms of hunger, food right is necessary, and food right has been also designed and has been positioned to be able to tackle hunger. And in this journey of human beings on this planet Earth, food has been a party and a part to this journey. As far as I can just summarize it, the story starts with the hunter-gatherers period, where the early settlers period, like in the example of Taluğ, we didn't have people where people just went to bed fed when their neighbors were hungry. There was collaboration, solidarity, sharing, which were the basic and fundamental values. But day by day, when time passed, the inequalities deepened, and even though you're living in the same society, in the same community, in the same cities, under the same municipal local authorities, we have people who live fed all day or every day, or we have people always hungry. So I'd like to leave the floor to our speaker, Hilal Elver. What about the major transformations? What about the origin of these deep inequalities? How these inequalities occur? As you know, can you hear me? You can use this microphone. You know that in time, there are several different positive, affirmative issues that have been brought to us thanks to modernity, but we have also other issues that are brought to the attention of our societies because of modernity. There is a famous book by Hardy. It's called The Tragedy of Commons, and I'm sure you know it. So, which is the tragedy of commons and also the utilization of common or public spaces. So when we thought that we would become happier so that we can share and so that we can also delegate. That's what we thought. But when it became to common utilization, we know that the protection has been avoided, and it's a philosophy that explains how we have come to also disregard the importance. And here's what I'm trying to say. Of course, in the modern times, it was never the case when you lived in happily ever after and the comfort of all the other community members, because there were inequalities, there were ethnical differences, the ethnical privileges, and thanks to militarism, the property rights, ownership rights, which became more prominent and more important than other rights, leading to a legal need, which we call rights, not limited to the human rights. Just as our professor Iona Kutrade had mentioned, the term rights is a much broader term, and the legal concept was as follows. The limitation of an individual's rights also defines the limits of the other individuals. So when we overpass and then exceed our personal rights, we are in an area that is not protected by law, which has been taught to us at the Department of Law in the beginning of our rights. Before we started talking and tackling the human rights, in order to establish the social order, we have to know that our rights are limited to our own use as well. Thank you. Of course, in the global sense, understanding, acknowledgement of hunger starts with 1924, the economic crisis, and in 1945, where the United Nations have been established. In 1948, the Declaration of Human Rights was announced. Several different conventions, agreements, contracts, and several different extraordinary, deep speeches made in the United Nations, just like Kennedy's speech, which is unforgettable, which was stated as a human crime, and he said that he's going to just make sure that it ceases to exist in one of his speeches. And there had been several different goals set how it's going to be halved down, and it was always the intention and the efforts of the United Nations. And it was in 2015 where we will have zero hunger. Of course, we kept talking about it and kept talking about it, and the zero hunger goal never became a reality. Why is that? And of course, we have to explain one more thing, considering the human rights. And we have to also talk about the Declaration of Human Rights, which is a universal declaration of human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a very essential and significant document. Since it's only a declaration, it also doesn't mean that it should not be implemented and put to use. So while preparing the Declaration of Human Rights, the comfort and the excitement of that particular time frame, all the human rights were thought to be protected by all. But unfortunately, on this path that we have been covering, there have been several changes in the human rights, where political and civil rights became more prioritized, and economic and social rights became left back. In the Declaration of Human Rights, it was seen right to run these conventions, which have been divided into two, where civil and Human Rights Convention has been immediately held, and it was enforced on countries, but social and economic rights have been disregarded, has been omitted. And if you also remember the major difference between the West and the East, and the capitalist order and United States capitalist affairs, and every single effort has brought these economic and social rights not as a basic right, a fundamental right, but as a political right, and the most important right to be the civil rights. And thinking that this was the main statement of that particular era, although the conventions have started, it only became a solid act in 1966, which had not been seen as a priority. Of course, civil and political rights include a passive act of the state, but economic social rights also need to be passive, because it needs the state effort to be able to take action so that the individuals can perform their rights. And there had been some kind of a regression in the Cold Era, and after 1990s, although there has not been any kind of Cold War, because of the free market, liberal market rules, and the liberal market economy, has been the era where the policies for the health and economic and social rights, and how it's not to be very economic, especially in kind of economic regulation and the institutions that are pertaining to this kind of issues, like Economic World Forum or IMF, especially with being under the domination of the United States of America. They could not take actions because in the United Nations you can purchase your rights to vote and the number of rights to vote, since that was the implementation. Because of the financial institutions, the economic and social rights are almost like forgotten, and therefore, as a basic right in the Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention of Human Rights and every single document that has covering these rights brought us to a level where these rights are not protected or secluded, and the state does not also take that into consideration. But you have to protect them, you have to also perform them, exercise them. But because of that, and they said that they're going to prevent hunger, and Kennedy also spoke about that. They said we have a production surplus where we can just deploy it to hungry countries like the African countries, where we can also prevent hunger. And in terms of the hunger prevention, was turned into a foreign aid rather than the need.
This is very interesting. First of all, holding the state accountable, this is very rare. Being accountable for what you do is very rare. Speaking of rights, of course, the right holder is not the beneficiary. He, she is the subject of the right in question. And this is why nobody is holding others accountable, and nobody is there to be accountable for from the perspective of production. Of course, I'm from the agricultural perspective. I'm the professor from the agricultural school in the university. Of course, in order for, globally speaking, in order for the right to food to exist, the production should be sufficient for everyone, which is a precondition. Otherwise, things would be devastated from the food perspective. But today, the agricultural production in the world is more than enough. Why? How can we judge it as such? It's because a lot of the food is wasted and overfeeding is present. So it means that production and use of technology is not the solution for the right to food. So those who say that we feed the world are not right. We need something else, which is, in the agricultural systems, science should be in the main axis of what you do, but along with the science, ethical values should also be in the main axis. Ethical rules should be there to have a resilient agricultural system in such a way to meet the needs of humanity, and ethical rules are the main compass for us, the backbone. So we have to be collaborating, we should be in solidarity, we should respect the human rights, we should be comprehensive, we should be environmentally friendly so that we would be able to take the direction that the compass shows us. So, right to food as the human right can be solved in what sense? How can we solve this problem? Unless we solve this problem, what would be the end result that we would face? These are the questions. Because I remember that in June 1963, Kennedy said that we can resolve this issue. And back in those days, in November, the assassination took place. But Can you imagine? It was back in 1963 and we're in 2023 and we celebrated 100th year of the establishment of the Republic, but unfortunately we're not able to resolve the human rights from the perspective of right to food. So what can we do from the perspective of right to food? So in order for us to do something like this in this particular sense, one has to know what the right to food means. Was it what Kennedy was referring to, or was he referring to the food security? There's a huge difference in between these two. It means that you yourself and along with your family have the access to food. This is a policy. It is dependent on your will. You would do it or not. Some countries have the food security and some don't. And here's the difference. While referring to those two conventions, in the Convention of Civil and Political Rights, there is no right to the countries to escape from them. But from the perspective of economic and social rights, the states have the right to avoid. The declaration stipulates that if you're not economically sound enough, you can use your time to have food security. You're not violating the right to food. If you have the right, if you have the power to exercise the politics for food security, feel free to do it. Is there any sanction internationally? The protocol was endorsed back in 2008 and 2013. The states acting against the right to food were held accountable. But there were only 10 signatory countries to this protocol in this world. So it means that we have to ask this question. So the countries do not want to be asked questions. So they do not accept the right to food as a right. In the United Nations, no country says that nobody says that I'm not going to give any food to the citizens who are living in my territory. But the right to food is so much neglected, so much so that because when we refer to the agricultural systems or right to food, we should remember what the supermarkets do, or we should remember the rules established by the World Trade Organizations, and we should recognize the discrepancy between the developed countries and underdeveloped countries. And you should also remember the practices of China, United States, Russia, and India. And apart from those countries, no other country can talk about these. And four main conglomerates are very much monopolizing the situation. So who's going to protect the system? The NGOs are going to emerge to protect the right to food. If it's ensured thanks to your constitution, you can exercise your rights to litigate the state so that you can hold the state accountable. Can you proceed with that system? It's very difficult. Are there countries doing so? Yes. Latin American countries, they have certain rights ensured, right to food ensured by their constitution. But one has to say that in the constitution, just because you have the right to food in your constitution does not mean that you have the food security. Having food security means that you should abolish this non-just economic system internationally and nationally. When one says that, people say that, oh, you're asking for a coup, because after 1990s, the free market economy does not have any counterpart having a social justice system. I do not refer to socialism. Since we don't have that kind of a system in the world, there's no space for that, there's no discourse on that, and this is why right to food, petit à petit, over the course of time, is transformed into an understanding of food security, and the rest of the world endorses, willingly or unwillingly. And when you look at the situation of the developed countries. They do not have the power to do so. And the NGOs, on the other hand, can only be developed in the democratic systems. And this is why we are challenged by this particular situation. How many NGOs are there in Turkey which are interested in food security? So we are trying to establish a brand new association which is going to work on food security. We're going to be there to identify who's doing what. And there are very few NGOs in Turkey, and this is the situation in the rest of the world. And this is due to the discrepancy in between the balance of powers. If the balance of powers would not be equitable, would not be just in our country and the rest of the world, we can only have a rhetorical sense from the perspective of right to food. Everyone would make a reference to the right to food, but nobody can comprehend what exactly it means. Nobody would take the risk to make sure that things are in place from the perspective of right to food. Yes, of course. I started my sentence by saying that it's the fundamental need. I remember the quotation of Gandhi, which says that nature meets the needs of humankind, but does not meet the greed/passion of humankind. When Gandhi said that, the world population was around it was less than 2 billion or 2.5 billion. So this is what Gandhi said for 2 billion people. Now, the human population in the world is more than 8 billion, and there's a wild consumption. And the nature, can somebody says that nature meets the needs of the humankind? That's not what FAO says, according to their forecasts or presumptions. And we have devastated the natural resources, and there's climate crisis, and it's going to be much more difficult to meet the needs of humankind thanks to nature. This is a tremendous area to work on, and the global food system, as Professor has very well said, has deepened the discrepancies in the world, and it has the structural devastated the nature, and biodiversity is devastated, and carbon emission is elevated thanks to this, or unfortunately due to the system. But food is a right to have the access. This is the Food Association says, let me say it again, this is what we need to say, this is what we need to remember. The food should not be there to just to feed ourselves. We're referring to the right to food, but we have to strengthen our immunity. And what do the United Nations say about right to food? You should have the access to food which is compatible with your culture, human rights, and ethical norms, of course. Food is political. Food, from the perspective of history, it's a weapon. At the same time, unfortunately, this is what we can say historically. After the surplus production, of course, food can become a weapon. So, food and agriculture should be understood in a better way. This should not be left to the hands of free market. It should not be recognized as a commodity. Humankind has always been after seeking for the food, and there are those who are seeking for money, and there are those seeking for food, but persons' main target should not be blinded by this greed. Let me leave you the microphone to talk about this as well. So speaking of food policies, these are excessively discussed at the global scale, because when there are crises of hunger, United Nations come together to find a solution for it. Back in 2007 and 2008, there was a huge food crisis. First, global downturn was experienced, and this has ended up as a food crisis. And back in those days, the United Nations was there to make some reforms by establishing some committees in order to make a reference to the importance of food. Unfortunately, back in those days, they did not give the answers to the structural problems. It was because of the fact that the economic system can only answer those questions. It can be only possible to answer thanks to the financial systems. Back in those days, 2008, the companies have well understood that this is very important, and the financial companies have started to make investment in the field of food, and the big companies, big firms went to the countries, on wealthy countries which have fertile lands, for example, in Asia, Latin America, etc. They have purchased millions of hectares of land so that the food security of their own country would be guaranteed. And there is this nationalism of food. They were working together in solidarity, but we took an opposite direction. But after the pandemic, we saw the real crisis. And similarly, Secretary General of the United Nations said that food is a right to be respected. This is how he starts his remarks. So let's share everything. Let's be transparent in what we have. So everyone should be giving in terms of what they have. So as you know, Turkey has this grains agricultural system. If we did not have a war in Ukraine, and we would appreciate how the Black Sea is important and the straits are strategically important. This is what we would have recognized if we did not have war in Ukraine. Back in those days, even I was not aware of this fact. But today, after the war in Ukraine, Turkey's strategic situation is very much linked with food. And this is what Turkey did with the United Nations as of August. But recently, this grains corridor was shut down because Russia said that you're imposing an embargo at the level of UN. If you impose a food embargo on me, so I am not going to allow Ukraine to sell grains. How many tons of wheat left Ukraine and passed through the straits? If you would ask which countries welcomed or received the grains, there's Spain, Great Britain, and Turkey. So Ukrainian grains were bought by those countries, and less than 20% were bought by the countries in Africa who were struggling against hunger. And United Nations turned a blind eye on this crisis. So we're trying to find a way to see what we can do. Let's have an analogy of an urban area, of a city. There's this localization. And in the world, local policies are better exercised than the global policies in answering the questions. And this is why, as a citizen, or as an urban citizen, we need to find our way to do what we need to do so that equitable and democratic rights would be respected. Are we able to participate in decision-making mechanisms? Are we asked for our opinion? Who are we? We're producers, we're citizens, we're employees, we're workers, we work on the soil. Who makes those decisions? To what extent we're allowed to provide our input in making those decisions? What are our responsibilities? What are our obligations? What are we to do? Since if we have a right to ask questions, our responsibility to answer those questions should also be present. Unless we get together as the citizens, we won't be able to solve these food-related questions. neither in Istanbul, nor in Marmara, or in Turkey, because the distribution systems in Istanbul are very difficult, and people are facing difficulties in bringing food their home, and the students are hungry in schools, excuse me. Yes. Thank you very much, Professor. Since this is a meeting for local administrations, let me tell you a few words on local administrations. Of course, right to food is very important, and adequate amount of production should be present in such a way to be shared in an equitable manner. But in the initial days of the pandemic, it's very sorrowful to remember, but those initial days of pandemic made us remember the values that we need to embrace. And it has showcased how fragile the system back in those days was. In the initial days of the pandemic, people rushed to the supermarkets rather than pharmacies just to stock some food, and this is what the states did back in those days. The exporting countries shut down their customs to be self-sufficient. And some countries used to say that, oh, we have money, we can buy whatever we want. But that's not how it happened. Self-sufficiency is totally about this. And public planning in urban area or in food planning became upfront. And all these questions should be answered from the perspective of local production and consumption. One has to appreciate local production and local consumption, and this is what we have appreciated. But all these three circles, local and national and global circles, have an importance which has to be recognized, and these systems should be constructed in such a way to be resistant, resilient, to see further. Of course, while referring to food, we're going to be served with lunch as well. If you have a burning question, let me receive this burning question. Unless you have that kind of a question, let me close the session so that we would have lunch. Thank you so much. It's such a lovely thing to see you amongst us. Speaking of human rights, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us.